Good evening. Welcome to the Community Library live stream. I'm Martha Williams, Programs and Education Director at the library. Tonight we'll be hearing from several organizations in our valley about a summer use trail survey they jointly conducted this year to better understand how our trails are being used and to lay the groundwork for looking ahead to how we can best manage these multi-user systems that so many of us enjoy. We'll hear from Emily Rodrigue, Trails Specialist, and Sarah Gress, Executive Director of the Wood River Trails Coalition, Zach Poff, Recreation and Program Manager for the Ketchum Ranger District, and Lindsay Mullino, Executive Director of the Environmental Resource Center. After their presentation, they'll be taking your questions, which you can enter at any time into the live stream chat. The work that these presenters doing, I believe, is very important. Maybe that seems obvious when we live in a resort area with so many recreational opportunities around us. Perhaps it became more obvious in the last year and a half as our valley welcomed so many new faces, feet, and tires. Maybe you have lived in this valley for decades, or maybe you're a new resident here. Either way, there's a good chance that if you're watching tonight's program, you care about our trails, how they're being used and managed, what their future looks like as our valley grows, and how you can be a part of ensuring their health and the ability of all people to enjoy them. I assume because you are here that our trails are important to you, that they provide something you can't find anywhere else. So with that, I'd like to recommend, we always recommend a book at our programs. I'd like to recommend Florence Williams's The Nature Fix, Why Nature Makes Us Happier, Healthier, and More Creative. She takes us around the world exploring how poets and philosophers and inventors have drawn inspiration from their time in the natural world. She investigates the confluence of environment, mood, health, and creativity, how nature offers us ways to improve ourselves, to promote reflection and innovation, and to strengthen our relationships to one another. Our trails offer all of these things for us, so thank you for joining us tonight to learn about what these experts are seeing and what lies ahead. So with that, I will welcome Emily to get us started.
Thank you, Martha, for that introduction. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in here with us this evening. We're sorry that we can't all be together, but we think this is still going to be a great discussion of the results from this year's project. And we're really excited, to share what we found. So let's get started. So just a presentation, or a brief outline of this presentation. We're going to go through an overview of the project. Then we're going to move into the quantitative component of that, so looking at what our trail counters were picking up for just the level of impact and usership we were seeing on our trails. Then we're going to move into comparing some data that we have from a very similar 2012 trail survey project that was conducted compared to the data that we got this year in 2021. Then we will move into the data from the survey that you all took. Thank you so much for everyone who did take that survey. We really appreciate it. Then we will move to talking about some future happenings with this survey project and kind of how we see this work playing out both in 2022 and beyond. And then we'll move into the question and answer session that Martha just mentioned. So let's get started. So like I briefly mentioned, in 2012, Blaine County Recreation District and Sun Valley Economic Development embarked on a very similar trail survey project trying to get at how many individuals might be out there using trails in the Wood River Valley. And who were these individuals, both in a demographic sense and a trail user sense, and what were some things maybe that they valued. And this lined up really well with the vision that we saw for the survey this year. And it was great that this survey used a really similar methodology, a lot of the same tools, as we'll get to here briefly, and it made just comparing these two time periods and these two periods of use a lot more powerful. So in 2013, as many of you might know, the Beaver Creek fire occurred, and that really dramatically affected the landscape here, especially our trail system. Following that fire, we had the Greenhorn and Osberg trails receiving quite a bit of rehab work. In 2016, Deer Creek Trailhead had some major rebuilding operations going on. And in 2018, similar things happening at Alden Gulch. It was great that this survey happened in 2012 because a lot of that data was actually used to justify additional funding, additional programming, and additional support for these very important rebuild efforts for all the trails that we love so much. So last fall, in 2020, there began to be some discussion about the potential of doing another one of these surveys. And I'd like to invite Sarah Gress, Executive Director of the Wood River Trails Coalition, who's going to discuss how both a need and an opportunity were identified last fall, leading us to this summer survey project. And here's Sarah.
All right, thank you, Emily. Here I am talking to all of you out there, but empty room here. So about 5 years ago, I was on the Ketchum Ranger District Trail Crew, and I was writing grants in the fall. And the only data we had was this Wood River Valley Trail Study from 2012. 5 years ago, you know, seemed still relevant, but as time went on, like it's now almost been 10 years, and reaching for data that's 10 years old just didn't really, you know, wasn't really selling it anymore. We don't actually know what's going on. So it was obviously we needed some more data from now. So when Emily approached me with like, hey, I have a master's project, what do you guys need? And we came with the trail survey. I said, yes, please. I would love to have a master's student do a trail use survey. So we kind of pushed that through with Zach Poff, who will be up here a little bit later, to make that happen. And I think the Trails Coalition was in a really good place to do that because, I mean, quite frankly, we have a lot less red tape than the federal government. So I said, you want to do a trail use survey? Awesome. Let's buy some counters. We'll write a job description. I'll find funding. Let's make it happen. So we were able to turn that around within months versus maybe years or never if we had to get a federal employee to do that. So it was really great, and the Forest Service was very supportive and has been very supportive. And so it's just been a really great partnership, and I think now that we have this, we'll be able to make some more informed decisions. You know, you can't improve what you can't measure, and so now, you know, we can look at like, oh, Taylor Canyon actually might need a parking lot sooner than we thought because there's more people out there than we perceived. You know, perception is not necessarily reality, and so we just needed actual hard numbers so we can make some management decisions moving forward.
Awesome, thank you, Sarah. And so to kind of add on to those points, from 2020 to 2021, there was a 7% population growth here in Blaine County compared to just a 1% average annual growth for the 10 or 20 years before that. So just a lot of people coming to the area very quickly. Additionally, as we all know, during the pandemic, a lot of our activities were restricted, but one of the things that definitely was not was outdoor recreation. So combined with more people and greater use and greater engagement in this field, we definitely know that there were more people out there than ever, and this justified doing a survey this year. So over the course of the winter, Sarah and I got together to create a vision and some goals to really help guide the work that we are doing for this project. So our vision was to conduct a comprehensive trail surveying effort here on the Ketchum Ranger District in the Wood River Valley. And we really wanted the results of this project to build capacity for current and future trail management programming. And when we say build capacity, that can kind of sound like a vague term, but what we mean is taking the resources that we already have and making them work even better. So improving our efficiency as trails programs, remaining adaptable and effective even in the face of great change, and ensuring that our trail resource continues to be of a high value to our community. So our first goal was collecting reliable, accurate counts of trail usership at specified locations, and we wanted this to serve as a baseline for future trail surveying efforts. Our second goal was to administer trail use surveys to the public throughout the 2021 season, providing our project team with relevant demographic information, patterns of use, and trail preference information in our trail community. We also were hoping to collect at least 1,000 unique responses. And then finally, our third goal was to create a standard methodology that is easily replicable and matches resource capacities for summer 2022 and beyond. Because as you'll see throughout this presentation, having year after year data, and the more data that you can have to compare against, it just makes the conclusions that you can draw that much stronger. So to give a brief overview of this project structure, the main tools that we used to conduct this project were 6 Trafex infrared trail counting devices, and we had these on rotation at a pre-identified group of trails all throughout the summer, mainly from Memorial Day to Labor Day. We also used the FormStack software and their survey application to administer surveys both in person and also use social media and our website and some newsletters to distribute them online. And we went with this software application just because it is able to be used in an offline setting and still collect data, which obviously at a lot of our trailheads were out of cell service, so it seemed like a really well-matched tool for what we were trying to accomplish with this project. In addition, we conducted some parking lot counts at various trailheads, just as another way to gauge trail impact and usership. And then we also engaged in a limited amount of ground truthing. So actually going out to trailheads, counting the number of users we saw using specific portions of trails, what the user type was, what their route selection was, as a way to supplement and strengthen the conclusions that we drew with our counter data. And it goes without saying, this project would not have been possible without strong partnerships and just a really strong spirit of collaboration amongst the trails community here. So I would like to let Zach Poff from the Ketchum Ranger District introduce himself and explain the KRD's role in this year's survey project.
Perfect, thank you, Emily. I'm still not used to talking to empty rooms, so I apologize for that. But yeah, so this project is hugely beneficial to us as a land management agency. We have the opportunity to manage over 400 miles of trail, primarily single track in this valley. And so one of the things that we hear all the time is things are crowded, things are more crowded, there's more people than ever. And kind of what's been mentioned before from Emily and Sarah is, that's very anecdotal, and so we didn't have any hard numbers. The 2012 survey was great, and we used that a number of times for writing grants, leveraging for other funding, partners, bringing partners in, but we didn't have anything that was current. And so working with our partners as well, being the Wood River Trails Coalition and the National Forest Foundation, ERC, a number of different folks, we were able to put this together, and Emily graciously took this on starting last fall and last winter to get us some of this information so that we actually had some data as to what our use really was. And I think that you guys will find it extremely interesting to what our use was, currently is, and the use patterns. And a lot of the stuff that I was going to talk about has already been mentioned, so thanks a lot, Sarah and Emily, for doing that. But they did mention too, we couldn't do any of this without our partnerships. National Forest Foundation came in, Danny Southard, who is our manager for the Northern Rockies, and said, yeah, we'll buy the counters, no problem, and took care of that. Sarah coordinated all of the research component of it with Emily, and then Emily came in and did all the on-the-ground work and did all that. And so it's vitally important that we maintain these relationships as we move forward. And we're super excited to have a new data set that we can work with. And as Sarah mentioned, and I don't know if Emily did too, both Sarah and Emily were members of the Ketchum Professional Trail Crew. So we're always super excited to see them move on and do other great things in the community. And we'll be around for questions later, but that's really all I have right now. So thank you.
Thanks, Zach. So next we have Lindsay Molyneux, Executive Director of the Environmental Resource Center, which was another critical partner in this year's survey project, helping to expand the project's impact onto the next generation, actually, of environmental stewards. So Lindsay, would love to hear from you.
Thank you, Emily. It is such a pleasure to be able to speak with you this evening, and it is weird to speak to an empty room, or not entirely empty. So I'll just kind of speak briefly from the environmental education and sort of that next generation perspective. And it was actually fortuitous timing. So the Environmental Resource Center, our sort of main focus is really around environmental education in all of the local schools in Wood River Valley. So really providing resources for the next generation that will grow up to cultivate this healthy environment and really protect all these things that we love. And what we had been hearing increasingly over the last 2 years is that this upcoming generation is starved for sort of professional connections and really meaningful service projects, and they really want to pitch in, and they really want to learn, and they're learning all these things in school, they're reading stuff in papers, but they want to apply it, and they want to apply it at home. And so what the ERC was in the process of putting together over the past 2 years is a summer fellowship program. So the idea is we take, this past summer we were able to fund 8 fellows. And so these are kids who are either between high school and college or in between sort of their different college years. And the idea is that they spend about a third of their summer doing service, so like picking up dog poop and pulling weeds, a third of their time with amazing local partners, getting sort of professional experience, and then a third of their time on their individual research. So I knew that we had the correct partners when I kind of cold called the Forest Service, and then they got me in touch with the Trails Coalition, and I cold called Sarah, and sort of the initial reaction was, yeah, we would take a bunch of college students. We'll have them out on Saturday mornings at 9 o'clock. I was like, oh yes, that is when they're at their best. So I knew that sort of commitment to ground truthing and data and research was exactly the kind of lesson that we wanted our fellows to learn. So I will just say that the partnership with the Trails Coalition has been absolutely fantastic. They've been wonderful partners, and a lot of the conversations we would have with our fellows after they were out on the trails, kind of learning these practical experiences of how do you talk to the public? How is a survey put together? They really came back and we're constantly talking about sort of the specific professional mentorship. We're super lucky that we have world-class folks working in the local Forest Service and then also in local nonprofits. So they were able to kind of learn from people who are doing, kind of cutting edge, I can't really swear in the library, but badass research. And also who were modeling, I think, a way of thinking about environmental work that we tried to instill in our fellows, which is how can you open up space for many different people to come together and form ideas with information, with ground truthing, with data, and for them to see that here in action, while they were reading about it in the local papers, was really incredibly valuable. So I can't thank you guys enough, and it was such a pleasure to work with you. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Lindsay. And then finally, we want to give a big thanks to Catherine Rickson at Rickson & Cronin Luxury Realty with their charitable fund and their involvement with the Spur Foundation. This project really went from idea to on the ground with their funding and their financial support, so we cannot thank you enough. Just really great partnerships. All right, so to just give everybody a scope of where this project took place, we were focused on Ketchum Ranger District trails here in the Wood River Valley. The trails that we chose to both do surveys at and put counters at, it is not exhaustive of all of the trails here, but we were focusing on trails that we already knew had an identified pattern of high use, as well as trails that were surveyed and studied in the 2012 survey project, just so we could have some good things to compare against, as well as some trails that we had some questions about and wanted to learn a little bit more. So basically, you can see here from the Baker Lake area, north of the SNRA, down Highway 75, both on the east and west side, down to Haley and Deer Creek was the main areas that we were focusing on for this project. So now moving into the quantitative portion of this, our trail counters. Just a brief discussion of this technology that we use. So we use these counters called Trafex infrared trail counters. You can see on the right a diagram of just how these counters work. So that box and gray tubing is attached to a tree, usually around 10 feet away from the trail. I'm sure many of you saw them out there this summer. Thank you for not tampering with them. We really appreciate that. But when somebody passes in front of that counter, it detects that as a pass or a count, date and time stamps it. And these counters are great, right? They can collect counts on mountain bikers, on dirt bikers, on horseback riders, on hikers. The one thing about these counters, and we'll get into these assumptions and limitations here in a second, is just that they don't distinguish between direction traveled, and this made for some really interesting analysis, which we'll get into in a little bit. But the main thing to think about here is that trail counters are increasingly being used all across the country to manage trails, and so we were really, really psyched to be able to be at that kind of cutting edge of what's happening with trails management. So in Jackson, Wyoming, for example, trail managers there are using trail counters on the bike path that goes in front of the elk refuge to understand how are people complying or not complying with seasonal closure orders. They're also used on Forest Service trails in Whitefish, Montana, and even as far away as Pennsylvania and the Rails to Trails Conservancy to kind of monitor the effectiveness of that program. So some other assumptions and limitations that we just want to quickly discuss that we want you to consider when you're looking at all this data. The Trafex software uses something called an average daily total to extrapolate into monthly totals, seasonal totals, yearly totals. So there were a few select trails that were actually surveyed for 30 days at a time, but most trails were not. most trails only had a counter on them for about a few weeks each month before we would move them around to a different area. And this was so we were getting a pretty holistic view of both our trail system and also not just focusing on one trail during the month of July and using those averages to come to conclusions. So we really wanted to move them around as much as possible. So that being said, TrafX will take that actual count for the days that it was out there, work those numbers, and create average daily totals that, like I said, will then go on to create those monthly and seasonal totals. So just depending on how much a specific location was receiving a trail counter, you can come to certain conclusions about how accurate and reliable that data is. But we do think that we surveyed all of these trails enough to come to some basic conclusions. We also are just looking at trail usership with these counters from Memorial Day to Labor Day. So on average, there's 99 days in between those two dates, and for just simplicity's sake with calculation, we just rounded that to 100. And then we also want to quickly discuss the difference between trail passes and actual numbers of users. These are going to be two separate numbers, and I'm going to talk a lot about in this presentation. So number of users or trail user days is probably a piece of information that a lot of people are familiar with. Skier user days, for example, at Sun Valley is a similar application of that. It's a really useful piece of information to have for communication, education, and grant writing. Like I said, it's very tangible and readily understood by the broader public. Whereas trail passes, so not distinguishing how a person is going out and back or doing a loop on a trail, that kind of information is really useful from a project management perspective. So you can think of more passes as meaning greater impact on a trail, which will likely need more robust maintenance and management programs and longer standing structures to ensure that this trail stays sustainable in the future, the overall ecological resource stays sustainable, and we also maintain a positive experience for our users. Some other perspectives that we started to consider with these trail counters, as you'll see with some of the locations, they were recording a lot of information very late at night or very early in the morning, which could indicate wildlife, right? These counters are going to pick up anything that gives off heat, essentially, is how it works, and that includes wildlife. So one could ask the question, what is the implication, or what implications does this have for managing our natural resources here in the Wood River Valley more holistically? There's the potential of cross-referencing this data with fish and game collar tracking studies, which can shed light on the role of trails in wildlife migration or in human-wildlife conflict studies. So just some other things to consider when using these counters. So we're going to move into our first site, the Baker Creek drainage. We chose to study the Alden Trail, the Osberg Trail, Norton Lakes Trail, and the Baker Lake Trail. And you can see here, Osberg is definitely receiving the least amount of use, but what really stuck out to me in this was just how high of use Alden was seeing this summer, or at least that counter was picking up. We're still analyzing these results and trying to understand how this relatively unmarked and pretty inconspicuous trail that's also pretty far from town was seeing so much use. One theory that we're coming to here involves our counter placement. So the TrafX counter was placed at the Alden signpost, for those of you that are familiar, right at the entrance or exit, depending on how you use it, of the trail on Baker Creek Road. So there's a possibility that a lot of people that were camping along the road, all that dispersed camping, would see that sign, walk up some distance, whether that be a few hundred feet or a mile, and then turn back around. And so while this is still considered impact to the trail, it's not necessarily representative of a true user day or use of the trail from start to finish. So next year, we would really like to be studying Alden Gulch more closely, just based on the high use that we saw this summer. So placing a counter at both the bottom and the top of the trail. And this will give us a better understanding of the impact users are having on the entire length. Another piece of mysterious information involving Alden was the time of day that the counter was picking up a lot of activity. And you can see here that trail activity remains really high all the way up until 9 p.m., which is not happening at a lot of other trails. This is where we wonder about the counter picking up passes from campers who might be in the area and want to take a post-in or stroll. That being said, it can't be denied that there were days this summer with just really impressive use on Alden. Saturday, July 3rd, for example, saw 297 passes, and each of the following 4 days saw just over 200 passes as well. So people are out there using Alden, and it's great. All right, and here are some monthly totals for the Baker Creek drainage. Again, these monthly totals were extrapolated from that average daily total that I mentioned before. But Norton Lakes in June definitely seems like it was the spot to be. It had an exceptionally busy day on June 27th, where there were over 608 passes. And for those of you who are familiar with the area, most people hike the Norton Lakes Trail in an out and back fashion. So if we make that assumption that 100% of people did that trail as an out and back, you could half that 608 and you're gonna get roughly around 300 users for that day. But it's still a ton of use, again, for a trail that's far from town, relatively hard to get to. But yeah, this June 27th, that day and that weekend was actually the same time as the Sun Valley Revel Marathon, if anyone remembers. And so given the time that it takes an average person to hike to and from Norton Lakes, which is around 3 to 4 hours, it could possibly match up well with the time that it takes someone to run a marathon. So there's a theory that there could have been family or friends trying to pass some time before the racer was finished, especially because Baker Creek Road is on the way back into town from the drop-off point for that marathon. But even with the 2 highest days, and June excluded, Norton still showed some of the highest readings, indicating that it's just getting consistently high use, even outside of large event weekends. So these are kind of the conclusions that we can draw about the Baker Creek drainage. So Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, those weekend days, definitely the most popular. Something interesting is that Baker Lake Trail is distinctively appealing to users. Osberg is only about 50 yards away, the trailhead, but it had dramatically lower counts. And when we look ahead a little bit to analyzing some of our survey data, one of the things that you as our respondents said were very or most important was having the variety of terrain types to experience on a trail. So Baker Lake has a lake you can go to, there's alpine views, there's sage areas you can walk through, so that could be some of the reasoning behind that. And then you see the total trail impact estimates for that peak summer season we were discussing. And so we can see here that Alden is seeing quite a bit of use again. Even if we assume that everyone that's using Alden is doing an out and back, which is probably not the case because there is very easy access during those summer months to drive to the top of it, and it's a popular mountain biking trail, so there's plenty of shuttling that happens, people just doing it one way. It's much more fun to get driven to the top and ride down than it is to pedal to the top and ride down. It's still an impressive number of individual users for the peak season. So if you add all of these users up between Memorial and Labor Day, that's just under 36,000. And just for reference, Albertson Stadium at Boise State University holds about 36,000 fans. So that can kind of give you an idea of just how many people were out there on the drainage this summer. Moving to Fox Creek and Lake Creek, this graph shows just the total number of passes, not users, but passes that were occurring for the counters there. What's interesting to note is that June is the lowest overall month, and given smoke levels, as you're all aware this year in July and August, we thought we might see some lower numbers there, but for whatever reason that we're still trying to understand, June was seeing some lower use. In addition, September and October were seeing higher use than June, and that's out of our peak season. Here we have a breakdown of the hours of the day that Lake Creek and Fox Creek saw most of their use. So they're especially popular with the pre-lunch crowd of trail users. And if we analyze the ages of respondents who answered Fox Creek and Lake Creek on our survey as their favorite trail, or one of their favorite trails, we see a trend that leans towards the middle to older age categories. And so this could signal that many Fox and Lake Creek trail users are either retired or they enjoy a high degree of flexibility in their work schedules. All right. Moving to Taylor Canyon and Pioneer Cabin. So Taylor Canyon use varies, as you can see there with the black bar on the left graph, varies greatly across days of the week and also time of the day. So 60% of the respondents who actually took the survey at the Taylor Canyon trailhead labeled themselves as full or part-time residents, which indicates really a locals-only almost pattern of use at this location. And given, again, the increased flexibility in working hours and schedules with this new era of remote work, this could explain the variability in use patterns and that prolonged pre-lunch use of the trail, versus seeing a spike early in the morning before work would start, maybe at 9, and after that 5 o'clock clock out time at work. Pioneer Cabin, on the other hand, sees a much more prolonged, steady use throughout the day, likely due to its increased length and relative difficulty as a trail. Additionally, people often stop at the top, check out the cabin, so people are just going to be finishing that hike at a much greater variety of times. So moving to total trail impact estimates for the summer peak season. For a lot of people, seeing Pioneer Cabin with a lower user count than Taylor Canyon could be pretty surprising. With Pioneer Cabin, we assumed that this estimate, everyone was doing an out and back. We know that there's other ways to get the Pioneer Cabin, so that number could have a little bit of variability in it. But consider this when you're looking at these numbers between Taylor and Pioneer Cabin. So out of those who took our survey and listed themselves as full-time residents, 60% of those people said that Pioneer Cabin was one of their favorite trails. And speaking from personal experience and also just talking with others, Pioneer Cabin, if you're a local, is something that you maybe do once or twice a summer. It's a destination hike. But a place like Taylor Canyon, with its proximity to town, its relatively short distance, and its moderate difficulty, it likely sees many more people who live here routinely using it once, twice, or sometimes even more each week. 70% of those who listed Taylor Canyon as a favorite trail were also listed as full-time residents, which kind of reinforces that theory. Moving to Adams Gulch, so we were placing counters on Sunnyside, Shady Side, and Old Adams Road. Interestingly, Sunnyside saw a significant increase in use during the month of July, which is generally one of the warmest months of the season, and like the name implies, not a lot of shade and cover out there, so we found that interesting to just see such high use in that location. One theory is that there could be a significant influx of people coming in on that Lake Creek Connector Trail, for those of you familiar with the trail system. That Lake Creek Connector Trail ends just above where we place that counter, so anyone doing Lake Creek Connector is likely gonna trigger that counter as they go to the Adams Gulch trailhead. And if you look at the data for Lake Creek, July was also its busiest month. So that is a conclusion that we are drawing there. We did expect Old Adams Road to produce the highest counts, as it's really that central artery to Adams Gulch trailhead, and many people use it to do that sunny side or that shady side loop. But take a look at July. Old Adams Road is not as consistent as we would have expected, and we think this could be due to a variety of factors. One of these includes the counter placement and trail design, and a counter's ability to accurately record users. So it's our first year of this project, really learning how this technology works, and this was a great learning moment. So originally we placed that counter on the sign post behind the kiosk at the trailhead, but after doing some surveys there, we noticed that a lot of people were using a social trail that actually goes behind that sign post, and so they were not getting counted. So we made the decision to move the counter farther down the trail on Old Adams Road where there weren't any social trails, hoping to get people as they funneled out into the trail system. But we also found out that this might not be an ideal location either. Being an old road, it's a pretty wide stretch of trail for that first mile, and so you could easily have 3 hikers or bikers side by side as they're chatting away, going up the trail. And so as that group goes by the counter's only gonna record one of those people. It's not sending an infrared beam through 3 people and counting all 3. So we think that there could be some variability in that number as well. In future years, we really want to find a location that can accommodate a counter and its capacity to detect users and also produce some more accurate results. And this will likely be much further down the trail. So here, looking at our total trail impact estimates, about 11,600 for Old Adams Road, almost 16,000 for Sunnyside, and then just over 14,000 for Shady Side. And similar to Lake and Fox Creek, Adams Gulch is the busiest in the pre-lunch hours, as you can see in the graph on the left. That being said, it sees a much more sustained use after lunch and even sees a small bump in use around 5 p.m., likely due to that post-work crowd of people. All right, so Greenhorn proved to be definitely the trickiest trail system to try to come to some conclusions about the actual number of trail users. So a ton of other systems connect to the Greenhorn Trail. You can get to Greenhorn if you do it strategically from as far away as Smiley Creek in the Sawtooth Basin. So you have people coming in from Warm Springs, you have people coming in from Deer Creek. Additionally, we recorded parking lot counts in the 30s and 40s during weekends in the peak season throughout the day. So in general, Greenhorn we know is seeing a ton of use from a ton of different user groups. Additionally, it's also conveniently located right between Ketchum and Haley. And so one piece of information we were trying to tease out at this location was spatial trail use patterns and how much people were actually looping trails versus doing out and backs on trails. So as an example, the Greenhorn Imperial Loop is a very popular choice for mountain bikers. But we were interested in just how many people were choosing to do this loop and how this information could inform our final user impact counts for this site. So as the green bars here illustrate, June and July show the highest counts on the main fork of Greenhorn. This counter was located just after the few switchbacks after you cross the creek and the bridge, when you're traveling on that side slope before the junction with Imperial. Greenhorn's location in the southern part of the Wood River Valley can lead it, as we all know, to become pretty unbearably hot during months like July and August. So we could expect to see some more use during a cooler month like June. But that being said, with this location at Greenhorn, we again discovered that it's really critical to choose an effective location to place a counter to get those accurate, reliable counts of use. So for those of you who may not be familiar, the Greenhorn Imperial Loop is shaped kind of like a lollipop. You're gonna start at the Greenhorn trailhead, travel out, do the Imperial Loop, come back down, travel out on that stick of the lollipop again, and go to the trailhead. So anyone that's doing that loop is gonna get counted on that counter twice. So when we relocate the main Greenhorn counter beyond that junction to the Greenhorn West location, which is indicated by those orange bars, anyone doing the Greenhorn Imperial Loop would only be counted once because Imperial exits below where we put this counter. So all in all, this made for some really complex analysis of the counter data, but when we adjust those green bars in June and July with monthly counts with a rough estimate of about 40% of users, so 40% of those passes being people doing the Greenhorn Imperial Loop, thus only needing to be counted on that Greenhorn main, that green bar counter, once as a single user, we see counts that mirror August, September, and October data much more closely. We obtained this rate of about 40% of users at Greenhorn doing the Greenhorn Imperial Loop from our limited ground truthing and observational studies. So thank you to the fellows for providing the information to come to that conclusion. So in the future, we really hope to develop a more refined system of measurement for Greenhorn, including a detailed study of all of these different trail junctions and their respective flow patterns. But we just want to stress again that these are our best estimates for total trail user numbers. When in doubt, the total trail passes can be a really good indicator of just general activity levels and impact on a trail. So here we have the total number of trail passes from Memorial Day to Labor Day across all of the trails that we placed counters on this year. So Sunnyside up there with the most passes, followed by Shadyside, Alden, and out at Greenhorn. And when we take these numbers and compare these to the trail passes that we have for the 2012 study, I think this graph just says everything that everyone's been talking about anecdotally. Things seem busier, trails are getting used more. I mean, a place like Fox Creek, over 200% growth in trail passes. That's just absolutely massive. So these graphs not only highlight just the impressive uptick in use over the past decade, but it also really speaks to how valuable having yearly data to compare to is in trail resource management. These numbers just have such a greater impact when they can be compared to other years. And so this is why we see the continuation of this surveying effort as such a valuable tool for managing our recreational trail resources here in the Wood River Valley, which only continues to grow and expand. So all in all, our rough estimate for total trail user days was 133,428. And you can compare this to the total number of skier days for the most recently available data at Sun Valley, just under 400,000. So not as much as the skier days, but just some things to keep in mind. We did not place counters on all of the trails here in the Wood River Valley or in the Ketchum Ranger District. We also did not place counters on these trails for the full non-winter use season. We're just looking at use from Memorial Day to Labor Day. But people are out there using the trails as early as April and as late as November in some cases. Additionally, those counters were not at every trail for every single day. So just remember how that average daily total factors into these user days that we came to. All right, moving into the qualitative portion of this, our form stack survey. So the first question, for those of you that took the survey, if you remember, asked you, are you a full-time resident, a part-time resident, or a visitor/tourist to the area? So this is our breakdown of those of you who responded you were living here full-time. That was definitely the bulk of responses that we received. The average was 18 years. The highest response for years lived in the Wood River Valley was 56. And we also saw a large spike in those who reported to have lived in the Wood River Valley for 20 years. So Around 2000, 2001, we had a lot more people moving in here. The number of years that people reported living here part-time was pretty evenly spread across years. And just for reference, we consider full-time to be greater than 6 months and part-time in that 3 to 6 month range. In terms of visitors and tourists, most who took our survey were either on their first visit or they had visited here 5 or more times in the past. So people are either discovering it or they have discovered it and they love it and they keep coming back. Just some basic demographic information that we were able to collect from the survey. So the average respondent age was 51 years old. About 53% of our respondents were female and 46% were male. And then in terms of our racial breakdown for respondents, 94% identified as white or Caucasian, 1.1% identified as Asian, less than 1% answered as Hispanic or Latino or biracial, and 3% answered other. And just a side note, this was not a choose from the list below. This was asking our respondents to self-identify and write in their response. So this is a breakdown of the different user groups here in the Wood River Valley. I think this place is so great because it has so many different trails that all appeal to all sorts of different user groups. This is certainly not just a mountain biking community, as you can see by this graph here. It's certainly not just a hiking community. We have trail running, we have horseback riding going on, and that is kind of the general breakdown. So most people reported that they used our Wood River Valley trails to hike and walk, followed by mountain biking, trail running, and then a split between the other uses that you see there. Popular other uses that people wrote in that they use the trails for are things like dog walking, fishing, and wildflower viewing. So looking at how people answered for when they were identifying as multiple user groups, the majority of trail runners also engage in hiking and walking, which probably doesn't come to us as a surprise to most of us. 76% of mountain bikers also said that they use the trails to hike and walk. Interestingly, only 6% of those who said that they engage in mountain biking, so out of all of the people that said, yes, I use trails to mountain bike, only 6% of them said, yes, I also e-bike. And that is the same percentage for those mountain bike users who said, yes, I dirt bike. But if you flip that around and you look at everybody who answered, yes, I dirt bike, and yes, I e-bike, the majority of those respondents do engage in mountain biking. So what does this tell us? It tells us that most mountain bikers who took our survey do not engage in motorized two-wheeled travel. But interestingly, over 70% of those who did say they engage in motorized two-wheeled travel do engage in mountain biking. So this information just helps us get a better understanding of who our users are, what are different strategies and different perspectives we can offer them when educating and communicating about trail etiquette, for example. These are your top 10 favorite trails based on the response data. So Adams Gulch, Greenhorn, Fox Creek, our top 3. One thing we just want to note is that we made an assumption here with this survey is that when we said, please choose your favorite trail, this was going to be a trail that you visited most often. But that is not necessarily the case if you think back to the Pioneer Cabin versus Taylor Canyon example. So in future iterations of the survey, we plan to distinguish between these 2 points and actually ask them as 2 separate questions and ask people which trail they visit most often and which trails are their favorites. But overall, these responses make a lot of sense based on our parking lot counts, the proximity to town, our trail counter data, and the fact that a place like Greenhorn, for example, is really amenable to all the different user groups. So you're gonna be seeing it listed as a favorite amongst not just mountain bikers, but also horseback riders and trail runners, for example. So this is comparing the favorite trail versus the total trail impact. So here's a graph of total trail passes. And if you think back to that graph you just saw before, in general, they line up pretty well. The top 3 reported favorite trails and the top 3 total trail passes are the same. So in general, we can say that the number of people who reported a trail as a favorite has some correlation to the level of impact that it received. So now we're going to go through how you all responded based on your residency that you reported and then what your favorite trails were. So in general, everybody loves Adams Gulch. 50% of those who identified themselves as full-time residents said it was a favorite, 70% for part-time, and 60% of all visitors. Greenhorn, the highest percentage we saw there was amongst full-time residents, so definitely a local spot, and that makes a lot of sense, again, with its location between Ketchum and Haley, serving both of those communities. Next, we have Pioneer Cabin, which surprisingly was not a top spot listed for visitors and tourists. For all that it's advertised, it's online, it's suggested at hotels, only 24% of visitors and tourists reported this as a favorite trail. 60% of full-timers did report this as a favorite trail. So if you remember back to our counter data, this seems to make a little bit more sense and reinforce that. Proctor is most preferred by part-time residents. 40% of part-time respondents said that this was one of their favorite trails, and this was the highest percentage amongst all the residency types. So Taylor Canyon, we're seeing as the ultimate kind of locals-only spot right now. 70% of those who listed it, or listed themselves as full-time, listed it as a favorite spot, versus only 3% for visitors and tourists. And then one other really interesting piece of information that we got in the data was 7% of visitors and tourists listed the Warfield Trail as a favorite, and we really think they might be getting it mixed up with the bar and distillery in town with the same name, because it's a very obscure, very random trail, to be quite honest. Whereas only 2% of full-timers listed as a favorite and 1% of part-timers. But in general, everyone loves a post-ride beverage, and we'll support that. All right, so now an interesting question that we were able to ask with this survey was how people perceived crowding on the trails. We've heard, like Sarah mentioned earlier, anecdotally, use is up, things feel more crowded, and we really wanted to ask you all how you felt about that. So here you can see the breakdown of encounters with other trail users. So the majority of people encountered in that 5 to 10 range of other users, then pretty even split between 10 to 20 and less than 5. So for 10 people or less, over 70% of you all said that, no, this does not feel crowded, I'm okay with this is a good thing. When we start moving into that 10 to 20 other encountered range, we start to see a little bit more variation in those who say, yes, this felt crowded, I did not like this, versus, no, this felt fine, this did not feel crowded. And then we move to 20 or more people right, and to be expected, we start to see more people saying, this felt crowded, I didn't like this as much. So some questions that we're considering with this feedback and information: where did these encounters occur specifically on the trail? Did it happen at the trailhead, or was it 2, 3, 4 miles out on a trail? Does that distance from the trailhead where people are encountered have an effect on how people perceive crowding? Additionally, how does the size of group that one encounters affect the overall experience of a user? This information could be really valuable to guides, to outfitters, to hotel concierges when they are consulting people on where to go, maybe if they have a large group, and where they might plan to bring large groups themselves in the future. The trails that our respondents perceived as being most crowded were Adams Gulch, Greenhorn, Taylor Canyon, Fox Creek, and Chocolate Saddle. So our counter data, again, really reinforces this, as well as the trails that were most commonly listed as favorites. You can see the hourly averages for places like Adams Gulch, and Taylor Canyon. That star on the left indicates an hourly average of 10 or more users as you move above that. And you can see for a bulk of the day, there are definitely more than 10 people on average using those trails. And that corresponds really well to the feedback that we received from you all, where you start to feel a level of crowding. Additionally, this summer, we've seen reporting on Chocolate Gulch, seeing a really big uptick in use and starting to encounter some parking problems there. And so this survey data reinforces what we were reporting on earlier this summer, and is going to be really important as we look to manage this trailhead and manage this trail system in a way that's sustainable and also respectful to the landowners that are giving us access to that trailhead. So if you remember on the survey, there was a big matrix listing about 9 or 10 trail characteristics, and we asked you to rank those from not important at all to extremely important. So these are the top 5 that you all value and consider. And we were looking at the number of people who said something was very or extremely important. So number 1 is the opportunity for solitude. I think that's a big thing that people just value about this area in general, is that it's not too hard to hop on a trail and really feel like you're getting away. But that is changing. Again, the variety of terrain types, like was mentioned before at Baker Lake, is something that you all value quite a bit, as well as a sufficient challenge and complexity of trail features. The time of year, the season that it is, factors into your decision to choose a certain trail, as well as the ability to loop or lap a trail. Some other interesting points that we found in the data, with the most responses of not important at all, was parking availability. For all that we heard and all that we have been hearing about how parking is getting crazy at some places, and Greenhorn seeing 30 to 40 cars every hour on a Saturday in July. Apparently, people who took our survey are not super deterred by this at this point. Users feel most neutral about the opportunity to experience wildlife, as well as avoiding areas with wildfire damage. And this is actually kind of some good feedback to see. We can let wildlife be. People aren't looking to go and pursue encounters with wildlife, which is probably a good thing. Additionally, there's really no avoiding wildfire on this district. It's everywhere. We live in the high mountain west, fires happen, so it's good to see that people aren't too deterred by that. Finally, we're looking at our trail information source. So we asked you all, where do you go to get your information about Wood River Valley trails? Things like current conditions and rules and regulations. So the number 1 and 2 things were BCRD's Summer Trail Link, which if you haven't checked out that website, highly suggest it. It's a great example of just what can happen when you have different agencies and a really involved community coming together that's dedicated to sharing accurate, up-to-date information about our trails, as well as word of mouth and information from others. So this shows us that some of our biggest tools for sharing information are just right here, rooted in our local community and our collective knowledge that we've all gained, whether we've been here for a year or for 50 years. All the experience we've had on these trails is a really huge asset, and we at the Trails Coalition and as trail stakeholders here in the Valley, we want to continue to build on this information and this great just wealth of knowledge you all have and tap into this potential in coming years. So that was a lot, but looking towards next summer, the biggest thing we want to say is that we are going to be doing this survey again in 2022. Sarah is going to come up and briefly explain the Trails Coalition's long-term vision for this survey project and how year 1 of this project will transition into year 2 and hopefully beyond.
All right, hi again. I hope you all enjoyed that. That was a lot, super awesome. So yeah, obviously this is extremely valuable and we want to be doing this every year in some fashion, but the idea is to do it sustainably, so you probably aren't going to be greeted with people asking you questions with an iPad every summer, but you probably will be riding, walking past a trail counter. So Emily's job this winter will be figuring out basically a systematic approach and a 5 to 10 year vision of what data do we need, what do we want to continue doing, and how can we make it the most reliable and consistent. And some of that is figuring out our counter placement, which obviously created some issues out Adams Gulch and Greenhorn, and then getting some more counters so we can get more trails counted, have them out longer, as well as parking lot counts, because we did that, but that wasn't a massive part of this, and I think that would also be very helpful. And then I think within that is creating those long-term research questions. We don't want to just be collecting data for fun, because that doesn't get you anywhere. But what do we want to know and why? So we'll be figuring that out this winter. And if you have thoughts and ideas on this, we'd love to hear from you. Our emails are on the website. Please email us. I'm happy to talk about this. So yeah, reach out if you've got input.
Thank you, Sarah. All right, so like she just mentioned, if you have any questions at all about anything you saw today or just questions about this project in the future, please feel free to email me. I will be more than happy to answer it. But I just want to thank all of you as users for getting out there this summer, using our trails, just being so respectful of each other. We think that the Mountain Manners Matter campaign with trail etiquette was really successful, and we really appreciate you all taking the time to engage with that. Thank you for volunteering with us this summer. And also just thank you to Sarah, Justin, Lindsay, Zach for being here, speaking to this project. This community is awesome. Everyone is so engaged in what's going on here, and it feels really special to be a part of it. Especially as someone, like Sarah briefly mentioned, this is my 3rd summer working on the Ketchum Ranger District's professional trail crew. So I've gotten to walk these trails. I got to talk to so many of you at survey sessions at trailheads this summer, and it was an absolute delight. So thank you for all your feedback, thank you for your involvement, and thank you for continuing to support us, and we look forward to seeing you next summer. We will now be moving into our question and answer session.
These just flip on and off.
Great, thank you guys so much. We've got some questions coming in. So a couple kind of like specific questions about the counters and the process, a couple kind of broader questions about the information you've gathered. I'll just go right in order. So Beverly wants to know, since the counters can count wildlife, do they also count dogs?
Yes, the counters do, or I should say, they have the capacity to count dogs. They're really aimed when you set them up. We install them on trees. They're supposed to be detecting humans at hip level. So if you have a small dog, it's probably not being detected, but there's obviously a lot of big dogs in this valley too. Everyone has dogs. So that is definitely something that we are looking to explore in future iterations of the survey. And again, it gets back to just that difference between trail passes and impact versus trail users. So we were able to use the data to come to some estimates about user counts. Those passes are higher than that, and dogs are part of that. And dogs, as we know through the work with the ERC and the PUP program, have a big impact on our trails here.
That's actually a question I had, so I might jump to that. I think everyone kind of touched on what this information is going, like how you're going to use it, but maybe now that the rest of us have seen it, could you each talk a little bit again about how your organizations will be using it? We'll start with Lindsay.
I can go. Yes, so I think that, so I will kind of echo what's been brought up before where, a lot of sort of the long-term planning, having these numbers for grant applications and for trying to bring money into the valley to meet increased demand. That's something that the ERC is also, it's so incredibly valuable. It's so incredibly valuable. So it's really a public resource. On sort of the operational piece, I guess I can maybe speak to something that happened actually this summer. So, we were sort of getting the preliminary updates of the numbers, and we're super excited to see what was going on. And actually, so the ERC runs the PUP program in conjunction with the Forest Service and other land management partners. And we happened to have an extra bin ready to go. And in previous years, we would have sort of, kind of looked around and not really made sort of a numbers-based question on where should this bin go to meet peak demand. And so we were able actually to look at the preliminary information and go, holy cow, who knew that Taylor Canyon was so busy? Not us. And actually, go ahead in the middle of the summer and place a dog poop bin out there. And I don't know off the top of my head, but I want to say we were pulling maybe 50 to 75 pounds of dog poop out a week. And that's something that just, thinking about the stress on the environment, the fact that we could do that within a month, kind of luckily the stars aligned and that we were doing a data-driven decision. I think that's exactly the kind of coordination that we find so valuable. Otherwise, we would have been just sort of guessing, and Blaine County's pretty big, so it's nice to narrow it down a little bit. So that's one thing that comes to mind kind of practically for us. So,
Lindsay, can you just briefly explain what the PUP program is for those who are watching who might not be familiar?
Yeah, absolutely. So the PUP program is a wonderful acronym that stands for Pick Up for the Planet. And this is about a 10-year-old program that the ERC debuted in conjunction with a bunch of partners, because we're a valley not only of one dogs, but usually most family have two dogs. And so kind of since dog fecal matter is one of the sort of highest pathogen things you can put in the environment, and because we are in the high mountain desert, so our watersheds are super sensitive and everything kind of rolls downhill. One of the often what happens if people are leaving dog poop unattended on trails is it will get to a critical mass where maybe dogs aren't allowed on trails. And so kind of thinking about proactive management, this was way back when, the question was, is there something that we can do to make things a little bit easier for the community to do the right thing, to work together and to sort of say, we're all sharing these trails together. How can we continue to do so for as long as possible? And so the PUP program is currently on, I believe, 13 trailheads across different sort of land management areas, private and public property. And actually, we're going to use, talking about grant applications, we'll use some of these numbers to go ahead and try to get money to expand into additional trailheads, also into the winter. So we'd love to see this survey go into the winter, hint, hint. And also, demonstrate this program. We're actually hearing a lot of interest from other resort towns who don't have similar programs because they don't have this kind of coordination. What are you guys doing? How's this working? So that's something that we are definitely excited to be a part of as the numbers go way up. So.
Yeah, great. I would reiterate, one of the big things that we use this data for is for grant writing and trying to secure funds. And it's really good to have some actual numbers instead of, like we had mentioned before, anecdotal data. And then the other thing really is kind of what Lindsay mentioned too is data-driven decision-making. So, we're able to look at the use patterns and how many folks are out there and what those use patterns are, time of day, and perhaps make management decisions as to, how do we diversify the use on our trail systems? What are our underutilized trails versus our potentially overutilized trails? And how do we, market or maybe divert some of that traffic over there so we don't get into a situation where things are loved to death, if you will. And honestly, this information it's like a little pot of gold for us to really dive into. And we could talk for a long time. I'll try to keep it brief and to that point. But those are the main points is, we have some real hard data that we can use when we're talking to folks and actually trying to explain what our use is. And then for the decision-making side, having some data so we know what the user patterns are.
Yeah, I'll just echo Grant's, obviously. We can actually demonstrate that it's busy here and has exploded. I mean, 200% increase on Fox Creek. That's absolutely mind-blowing to me. So I think that's obvious. And then also kind of decisions in terms of trail maintenance. I think everyone thinks I don't know, the Taylor Canyon thing, I think kind of Taylor Canyon versus Pioneer. I would have expected those numbers to be flipped. So that was really interesting for me to realize my perception was off of how busy somewhere actually is. And so looking at we need to get Taylor Canyon maintained at least once a year. People are there and getting a crew out. And when a tree comes down on Taylor Canyon, there could be, 500 people who walk around it if we don't get out there in a week. And I think those are important things to think about. Whereas if a tree comes down out Warfield, one person's going to walk, dirt biker's going to take care of it. But, so where's that use actually happening? And then in terms of trailhead upgrades and things, Taylor Canyon, I'm sure if you've been out there, that trailhead, I don't know where people are parking if that many people are going out there. So just making those sorts of decisions and I think long-term planning, as opposed to playing whack-a-mole. I think finally we've hit a spot with the trail community, with the Forest Service and partners and whatnot, where we've got a lot of the backlog taken care of, and now we can start thinking to the future. And once we start doing this every year, an iteration of it every year, we can find trends as they're happening. Everyone last year was oh my God, the forest is so busy. And I wish we had numbers before, we don't. But this is hopefully allow us to not be reactionary and be oh wow, Fox Creek is still starting to tick up. We need to do something about this versus a survey every 10 years or 200% of use. That's wild. So I think identifying trends as they happen will really help in the management and planning. And then also the qualitative stuff. And in terms of what Emily found in terms of dirt bikers being basically every other sort of user is really interesting to us. And also how we do our trail education and outreach, how do we talk to people about trail etiquette, knowing that most people do all of the things out there. And that motorized users are basically also all other users is really interesting. And I haven't quite figured out what that means yet, but I'm sure that'll come in handy with outreach.
And I know we're going over a little bit, but people are staying with us, so are you guys okay to keep going with a few more
Thank you
questions?
for staying with us.
Yeah. So Karen was, I think, interested in, Sarah, I think you mentioned this about parking availability not being a priority of this study. Could you talk a little bit more about that and maybe why it is not a priority? Is it just outside the scope, or who might that be a priority for? Maybe would be the question to ask there.
Like not a priority in terms of what we looked at.
Yes. Yeah.
I think we wanted to keep it as simple as possible the first year, because as we learned, even that was really complicated. So we wanted to kind of dial in what's actually happening out on the trails before we started dealing with parking lot stuff. I didn't want to create this massive program where we didn't get a lot of good data because we try to do too much. So we definitely will start incorporating that once we feel really dialed with how we're collecting the rest of the data.
Yeah, I can also, we did talk about that in the beginning, and we didn't know what the workforce would be. It was Emily basically on her own. And so we didn't know if we'd be able to handle that. And honestly, the other thing came down to was budget. We only had a certain amount of money that we were able to purchase counters with. And so we looked at doing parking lot counters along with trail counters, and we just didn't have the money this year to do that, unfortunately. And that's why I think Sarah mentioned before that we're looking at next year and into the future, moving into hopefully having some funding where we can do the parking lot counters as well. So it was a little bit of, personal capacity and then financial capacity as well this year. But it definitely was on the radar, and that is something that we need to look into in the future.
A couple more counter questions. Someone was asking about trail cameras, if those were considered as an option. Did I say that right? Trail cameras. And then someone else is wondering if any trail counters exist that distinguish between human and animal. Does this exist?
So yes, they do exist. Again, we are a small but mighty and growing nonprofit that has limited funding and resources. So we, like Zach mentioned, generously were given the offer for Danny Southard from the National Forest Foundation to purchase these 6 counters for us. And again, getting to what were our actual on the ground, like human capacity for managing this project this year, it was basically just me and then some help from the fellows as well on the weekends. So just understanding like what could I realistically get done out there this summer, and these counters that didn't distinguish between that seem to fit both in terms of that capacity as well as our funding capacity. Trail cameras have been used to assess trail usership in other studies. What is sometimes forgotten about analyzing trail camera data is that unless you have a very, very skilled and adept software engineer to basically take all of that footage and code it to be able to detect and distinguish between users or a user at all, someone has to take their time and actually sit through hours and hours and hours of footage. You can do that kind of trail camera work where it gets triggered when someone actually goes by. But again, with just the way that we know our trails are used, that was going to be out of the scope of, what's going to be an efficient use of our time and resources. If you think back to the vision for this project, we really wanted to build capacity for trail management here, and that's taking the resources that we already have or resources that we are knowing we're going to have access to and making them work better for us. So definitely tools that are interesting, and we would love to get some counters that can distinguish, because that would be a great way to not have to do ground truthing studies. But at this point in time, these infrared counters we think work well for what we're able to do.
So Karen shared, I might have misinterpreted her question about the parking, so I'm very sorry, Karen. She was actually referencing the fact that, Emily, you mentioned that parking wasn't a priority among the people surveyed, and that's what she was surprised by. So, Karen, thank you for clarifying that. I think we'll just do 2 more. I've got 2 more really good questions. One is there a plan right now to develop other trailheads throughout the valley to disperse the demand? That's probably a question for Zach. Yeah.
Yeah, yes and no. We always have that on the radar, and we're actually going to use a lot of this, again, the data that we have here, to see where that would be most beneficial. And some of the things, most of the areas that we have actually have a quote unquote trailhead. It's just a question of what that looks like. Obviously, our major trailheads look a little bit different than some of the more remote ones. So yeah, using this data, we'll look at it and see if that is feasible. And we have a whole process that we have to go through when we develop these. It's the NEPA process, and it's an analysis we have to do. And so it's a little bit cumbersome, but this will help us drive that decision to dive into that analysis and see that if it's feasible to do so.
Great. And so I think this is a great question to end on from John. He is curious how the public will be involved in trail management decisions. And so maybe it'd be interesting to hear from several of you how you see that playing out. You've just shared this information with the community. What do you want them to do with it? How do you want them to be involved in this? How can they be involved in this moving forward?
Well, I can start, and then I'll pass it down the line. But so I had just mentioned whenever we do any kind of major decisions, we have to do an analysis. And part of that analysis is a public comment period. And we have a public involvement and public engagement. And I would encourage any of you, as you see, I know in the South Valley, they recently did a new trail assessment, and there was a lot of public involvement with that. So when you see that, either the Wood River Trail Coalition will always have that out on their websites when we're making trail decisions, whether it be North, South Valley, Stanley, anywhere. And I would encourage everybody to get engaged with that and have your public comments submitted for that. And then again, I'm sure Sarah will hit on this too, but get engaged with our local either nonprofits or groups or clubs or anything else, and get out there and that word of mouth that Emily mentioned, that how people learn about trails. That's also a great way to hear about what's going on, future developments, anything else. We try to be as transparent as we can as a land management agency, and we want people's input on it. A lot of the developments that have happened in the past have been based on public comment. So definitely get engaged as much as you can through a number of different avenues.
First thing is if you don't show up, showing up's 90% of the job or something like that. It's sort of cliche, but it's true. And I think I'll just start this out with is that the Trails Coalition is not an advocacy group. So we very much, our mission is focused on boots on the ground, funds where they need to go, getting things done. So we aren't going to do a letter writing campaign. Like when I sit down with some land managers building new trails, I'm like, we're not going to sue you. Like, that's not what we do. We're here to help get things done. So that's where we're coming from. And so if Zach comes to us and is like, hey, we're looking at developing this new trail, how can you help? It's like if our membership is reaching out, like I kind of have an idea of what's going on with our membership. I had a member reach out this summer who was very interested in pushing a certain kind of trail. And I thought that was really awesome that they reached out and were like, hey, I'm really interested in this happening. And now I know it and Zach knows it, and we can kind of push these things forward. And I think kind of building that trail community where people can come to us and be like, hey, here's what I'm thinking, here's what's going on. And so I'd be curious with some of these numbers, if someone has a good explanation for Alden, I'd love to hear it, because that was mind blowing. What was it, like 12,000 users? That's crazy. It's in the middle of nowhere. So what's going on there? And I know there's we can't be everywhere at once, and I know there's people out there who are in Alden more than we are. So I think providing kind of that narrative for us to figure out what's going on. I'm semi-rambling. But I guess the Trails Coalition really aims to be kind of a large neutral party who gets things done and brings people together and kind of can be that mouthpiece where we all get together in a non-advocacy, non-adversarial sort of way. And that's what we're striving to be.
Yeah, to just kind of add on to all of that, come to our volunteer events, not just because the work needs to get done, but some really important conversations happen at these events too. This is how you meet your fellow users, not just in passing by saying hi, but you actually get to have some conversations while you really get some great work done. And like Sarah and Zach have said, get involved in that public commenting process, and always feel free to reach out to me. I know Sarah gets bombarded with calls and emails all the time, so maybe, direct them to me and I'll talk to Sarah about it. Just take that off her plate. But I'm more than happy to sit down with anybody, again, with things like Alden, things like Taylor Canyon too. If people have any thoughts, questions, ideas, we want to be here as a resource to help serve you to keep these trails in their best shape. And also additionally onto that, and kind of a side note I was thinking about earlier, who to thank. And one thing I just want to point out is that this summer, in the 3 years that I've worked here on the trail crew before, I have never been thanked so much and so enthusiastically by the public. So one, thank you for appreciating the fact that there are people out there 40 hours a week maintaining your trails, clearing trees, making sure that runoff and sedimentation is happening properly so that trail stays sustainable. Sarah said, if a trail goes down in Taylor Canyon and 500 people go around it, that's destroying the vegetation and the resource that surrounds it. And over time, at a place like this that we're seeing is getting so much love, that's gonna have an adverse effect at the end. So one, thank you for thanking us. And two, don't be afraid if you see people out there in those gray hard hats with tools, please stop and talk to us. We love to talk about trails. We love to hear your thoughts. And we can be a really great, avenue for relaying information. When we have interesting conversations with people on the trails, we definitely talk to people about them. So just stay involved, speak up, and reach out, and continue to just be the really awesome trail users that you all are.
Nice. Thank you all for being here and for sharing this. And I know there were a few questions on the live stream chat that are pretty specific, so we'll try to answer those before we go off air. But I think we'll close out here. So thank you guys again.
Thank you.
Ooh.